Before I launch into my presentation, I just wanted to tell a quick story about why I do what I do, because I think motivations matter here. And it's a really interesting, it's the best small world story that I've encountered in my travels of the developing world in the last 12 years. So I grew up in Arlington, Texas. I met several Texans here and was really fascinated by, for whatever reason, I can't really describe the origin, but African cultures, languages, and societies. The entire time I was growing up in Texas. And I studied African politics and Kiswahili in undergrad, and I was really hungry to get out into the world somewhere on the continent to try to understand firsthand how communities were experiencing conflict and trying to rebuild their lives. So my favorite restaurant in New Haven, Connecticut was an Eritrean restaurant. And I got to know the owners quite well. And when it came time to pick an undergraduate thesis, I decided I wanted to understand the roots of the conflict in Eritrea. Eritrea and Ethiopia fought each other for a long, long time, and in 2000, they were nearing a peace accord. So this restaurateur, where I was in college, introduced me to many of the women in his family who had fought for the Eritrean People's Liberation Front. And I set up a snowball sampling methodology, hopped on a plane, flew into downtown Asmara, and had the privilege to really understand firsthand, in these women's own words, why they fought, the experiences of fighting in the trenches and hand-to-hand combat. They had created literacy campaigns. Some of them gave open-heart surgery on the front lines, those who had medical backgrounds. Really incredible. And one of the female fighters invited me to her home, and as I'm looking through her photos, I almost fell out of my chair because there she is, standing in front of the School of Nursing in Arlington, Texas, part of the University of Texas at Arlington, where my mother is a professor. And she had been visiting her brother, who was studying in Arlington. And I thought, that is incredible. And then the next day, as I'm walking down the streets in downtown Asmara, Eritrea, I see a bakery called the Red Oven. My favorite bakery in Arlington, Texas is called the Red Oven. And I went in and found out that the owners of the Red Oven in Asmara used to work in the Red Oven Bakery in Arlington, Texas. And when they felt that they had a contribution in terms of rebuilding their country as members of the diaspora, they came back and opened up a bakery in downtown Asmara, calling it the Red Oven of the East. And those connection points were a huge takeaway for me, because the world is incredibly small, and we had some shared experiences in Arlington, Texas, and then I was hearing about their lives in Asmara, and I was really, really impressed by what they had lived through in the trenches and their hope and optimism moving forward in the country. So I'd like to talk about different forms of connectivity, the hard connectivity that we're all familiar with in terms of digital tools and technologies, but also the softer forms of how those tools underscore the way we interact as human beings. And in particular, try to make a point that connectedness in both of its forms can really be an incredible tool for empowerment, as we've seen in the Arab awakening and the revolutions across the Middle East. But it can also be an incredible tool to undermine human potential and human security. And when I use the term human security, I mean the freedom from fear and violence. So if you take nothing else away, just thinking about kind of expanding your aperture and thinking about connectiveness as both positive and negative. And I'd like to illustrate some of those points through some stories. So this map is fascinating. This was created by an intern at Facebook, and he took 10 million pairs of friends and mapped their connectivity worldwide. And I think this is just such a beautiful illustration of all the ways that our lives overlap. But it also underscores that these devices, our cell phones, the apps that we use every day, are building our identities and our public persona. Through Instagram or Foursquare, we're communicating how we go about our daily lives. We are putting our hopes and dreams out there, Twitter, YouTube, and we're leveraging networks of resources of other people who come from our world or don't. But we're also building communities and defining ourselves in opposition to other communities that may not share the same values that we do. A couple of stats that were really staggering for me. There are 12 million text messages sent every day. And every day there are 2 billion YouTube videos looked at, which is just incredible. And there's an incredible data flow coming out of all of our ways of connecting digitally. I think the stat was in 2012, we created more data as humans on this planet than we have in all of human history combined up until 2012, which is really quite staggering. So I want to talk about the ways technology underscore the way we fight, whether it's for change or fighting each other, the way we strive for economic opportunities and to feed our families or to overthrow a government, and the way that we connect using technology. The nature of conflict is fundamentally changing, and I think primarily as a result of these new forms of networks and applied technologies. If you were to just look at state-on-state violence, the world is getting more peaceful. That's the gray line at the bottom, fundamental trend downward. But the unfortunate news is that there's an incredible spike in the way people are fighting each other internal to states, large-scale civil war. I think there's some architects in the room, so we can have a conversation later about really the effects of rapid rural to urban migration and the stress on cities in the developing world. 180,000 people move to cities worldwide every day, which is incredible. And that really puts an incredible strain on cities and their capacity, their carrying capacity to not only provide essential services, but to also protect people and to protect their safety. And I think as you see a breakdown in public law and order, particularly in these environments where municipal governments in places like Pakistan or Mexico City just don't have the capacity to project their authority or to reinforce the rule of law, that creates a vacuum. And we're seeing criminals and organized crime and vigilantes fill that vacuum and start to fight, particularly in cities, in ways that are increasingly violent. So the way that we're connecting, the way people are moving to cities, all of these patterns are really reinforcing new forms of conflict internal to societies, whereas most of human history has been about state versus state conflict. So I want to tell 3 very brief stories. I thought stories would be the best way for this audience to kind of describe some of the different patterns. And I'm going to attempt to draw very quickly a connection between the smartphones in your pocket, and the chronic violence in Congo that's been simmering for many, many years. And also, I guess this weekend, Captain Phillips, the movie, Tom Hanks' new movie, opened up about Somali piracy. So I'm going to try to give you a different perspective on the creativity and the conflict entrepreneurism of Somali pirates. And then I'll end with a couple of interesting anecdotes of how several activists in Tunisia, Libya, and Egypt in particular use some of the apps that you use every day to help overthrow a regime. Okay, so I'm going to play a quick video for Congo.
I was in my house preparing food for my husband when the Interamwe came in.
If asked, most of us would say that name-brand laptops, cell phones, and other electronics come from places like Best Buy or Amazon.com, that they were made in China.
I cried for help. They immediately killed my husband. They shot him.
But that's just part of the story. Follow your favorite gadget back to where it came from before it was an iPod or a BlackBerry, and you'd likely end up in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. I did.
They took a machete and they cut off my leg.
I stood on the edge of a mine, surrounded by men and boys digging for the valuable metals that would become smartphones and laptops.
They had 6 children at home, so the Interamwe cut the leg in 6 pieces and gave them to the children to eat. But my child said, I can't eat a part of my mother. So they killed my child. He was 8 years old.
I met survivors, like Generos. I listened to her story. I learned there are hundreds of thousands of women in eastern Congo with similar stories. Because the bits and pieces that keep our phones ringing and our laptops glowing are funding the deadliest conflict since World War II. It all comes down to resources. Electronics wouldn't function without certain minerals: tin, tantalum, and tungsten, which we call the 3 Ts, and gold. Armed groups in eastern Congo control the mines and trading routes for these minerals, profiting to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars a year. To enforce their local dominance of the mining sector, some of the armed groups use mass rape as a weapon of war, preying on women and girls like Generos. I met Generos for the first time in 2007, but I already considered her a sister.
There are really no words after you see a clip like that. I mean, it's just incredibly devastating. And the conflict has been chronic and going on for many, many years. There's more attention now and consciousness in the world to conflict-free minerals, diamonds, and increasingly conflict-free technologies, but probably not as much as there really should be. What I think is interesting about the Congo example in particular, this woman who you saw there, Lisa Shannon, was in her home watching an Oprah Winfrey show in 2005, and that was her first exposure to the devastating human consequences of conflict and how our technological consumption is really driving that. And she decided to act instead of just turning off the TV. She created this Running for Congo Women project and has, as you see, sponsored many of the survivors. And the second part of the clip, which I don't have time to show, is inspiring. It's the human experience side of having your life shattered and living with these narratives, but coming out the other side and having a truly resilient spirit and finding meaning and inspiring other people in your community and giving them a voice. So I think this is a really interesting illustration of the dark side of connectivity in its hard form in terms of our devices and what that means for the supply chain and the consequences in Congo, but also an opportunity to act and to reimagine our role in the world and our connectivity between the voice and the advocacy we can provide for people who are living in this, with these experiences. So very quickly, this is a picture, I'm going to switch gears to another story, of a stock exchange in Somalia. So it's a pirate stock exchange. Many of us have heard about the challenges of Somali piracy, and this just blew my mind when I read about it. This stock exchange was created in a coastal town in Somalia, in Hardahir, in 2009. There are about 70 entities listed. Many of them are local and regional banks and private investors. And this is a very formalized system of commerce to pay out the ransom in a way that reinforces continual investment in the community. So I think many people right now who think about the challenges of Somali piracy are thinking about it as a maritime security challenge. But actually, it's an incredible driver for community development in Somalia, right? And this speaks to the point of really trying to understand people in systems, right? And so if you look at the kind of the point of impact, there were Somali fishermen who fundamentally could no longer feed themselves or their families because their waters were being illegally overly fished. So they took the power into their own hands and they created the Volunteer Somali Coast Guard and used that platform to essentially capture crews. And they went from about 10 or 30,000 in the first, about 50K for ransoms, 2008, 2009, to 10 million now for a ransomed crew and cargo. And it's very well organized. Investors in the stock exchange will put up money for the crews. They'll buy them GPS equipment. They'll provide them intelligence. They'll give them tracking equipment. And then the ransom is paid out, and a cut of it is used to support schools and hospitals. The district governor takes a cut and uses that to reinvest in the community. It's really, really remarkable when you think about all of the embedded systems. But what's fascinating is when you really start to zoom out. And I recognize this is a busy slide, but just really quickly, at the sub-nation state level, you have piracy as a political economy challenge and driving community development, and first and foremost, meeting livelihood needs. You know, and the community takes care of the hostages, they provide food, all of this is part of the price of the ransom. And it is allowed to exist, I think, because there are some very vested interests. So the transitional federal government is incredibly weak, and they have an interest in the status quo, which is why piracy is proliferating. Somalia hasn't had a strong central government, or any government, frankly, since 1991. Then you keep zooming out, and you start to see all of the other embedded financial interests, much like the supply chain example from Congo. So there are spotters in organized criminal networks in Russia and Italy, the mafia, who go around to big shipping cities in Europe and profile the different ships and their cargo. Then they communicate that to the Somali pirates who've distinguished themselves. And again, they're providing them financing, but also intel and technological, gadgets, tracking, GPS. And then when they are effectively seize the cargo, part of that ransom is paid to those people who were spotting in large European capitals. If the ransom is then if you need to airlift the cargo that's been ransomed, oftentimes that is happening in small transport planes all over Africa, and the Russian mafia dominates a lot of those transport networks, and those are the very same planes that organizations like the one I used to work for, the US Agency for International Development, leverage to provide life-saving humanitarian assistance in Somalia and other countries where people are starving or affected by political conflict. So there's a really interesting intersection between licit and illicit systems. And then you zoom all the way out, and you really see the shipping companies, the insurers, and the reinsurers benefiting quite substantially from this piracy, this threat of piracy, in the way that they've really driven up their profits and had compulsory policies of security forces. So this is an interesting example of conflict entrepreneurism, and I think it's important to understand where that comes from and how it manifests and how the different systems are embedded. The Arab Awakening, there's been a lot written by people who are far more familiar with it than I am, but as an observer, I think it is incredible when you look at some of the stats that reflect the connectivity in this particular region, and particularly when you compare it with the US. So between 2000 and 2010, in that decade, you had explosive growth in both internet connectivity in these countries and across the region, and also in cell phone penetration. And just as the reference point, 27% increase in internet connectivity in that decade in the US, but 83% in cell phone usage. Those sound high until you start to look at Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, and Syria, and it's just orders of magnitude different. It's really, really incredible. What's challenging and very destabilizing in this case for, I think, very positive regime change, although we're experiencing some of the consequences now, as we're a few years in, you have an incredible youth bulge across the Middle East, North Africa, the MENA region. And so between 50 and 75% of these countries' populations are 25 and under. But these youth don't have economic opportunities. Their economies can't absorb them. And so they're oftentimes decently educated, grown up in their country's education systems, don't have jobs, don't see the opportunity, and are particularly technologically savvy and online, playing an advocacy role and making connections. And I think that's a very potent destabilizing mix if it's not harnessed effectively. So many of us know the story of Wael Ghonim and the Twitter work that he really catalyzed in Egypt to overthrow the government. But this is a less known gentleman named Slim Amamou, a Tunisian, and it's really fascinating. There were some very effective community organizations rallying around soccer. They're called extreme soccer fans in many of these countries, ultras. And he was an online activist, and he connected with this network of very passionate people who were very used to expressing their discontent about a regime that had governed for 25 years in a very exploitive fashion online. And so he rallied them through his internal activism, and the regime, he popped up on the regime's radar screen. They arrested him. A friend of his over Twitter suggested that he turn on Google Latitude to track where he was. And then he checked in on Foursquare that he was being held and tortured in the Ministry of Interior. And that really catalyzed people to come out to the streets. So the soccer fans he had worked with previously, lawyers, the next day, teachers came out and demonstrated. And it just snowballed from there. And for a regime that had been incredibly exploitive, its population over 25 years was overthrown in a month. And this digital activism is a huge reason why. A couple other interesting examples very quickly, because I'm nearing the end of my time. These are apps that we all use every day: Foursquare, YouTube, Twitter, Google Maps. But these are some very creative applications. So I mentioned checking in the Ministry of Interior. There is a group, so there were these color revolutions several years ago in Europe, in Eastern Europe. And the one that happened in Serbia was nonviolent, and there was a youth movement called Otpor that really inspired folks. So the folks in Egypt looked at how this youth organization had applied activism and learned from them. And they actually developed an online video game that talked about where you could actually play out regime change and overthrowing regime. They translated it into Arabic, they used it in Egypt, and trained activists. And this became a really important community empowerment tool to actually game out how the regime would fall and what role they would have in that. In Libya, before NATO got involved, a schoolgirl, many of her friends were being shot at as a sniper. sniper fire, and she placed all of the different places where she felt threatened on Google Maps and was able to crowdsource that and provide that to NATO for some of the campaign planning. So truly, truly incredible digital activism. Finally, I'm out of time, but I'll just sum up by saying I really think that it's important to zoom out and find the system. And I think we can talk about the role designers play and your designer toolkit in really having lateral vision, thinking about the intersection of systems, but also understanding people in context and the human experience in context and the networks that they are linked to. I think oftentimes we look at a soda straw and try to diagnose a problem, and I think it's really important to zoom out. And in doing so, and you think about almost systems thinking applied to conflict analysis and technological connectivity, you're then more perceptive about what the leverage points are that will actually affect the kind of change you want to see in the world. And that leads to better outcomes in the future. Thank you.